This piece is a reflective, narrative-style retelling inspired by a video essay about Benny Andersson. It paraphrases the original's claims and does not include direct quotations attributed to Andersson, since those cannot be verified as things he actually said. Treat the interpretive and emotional claims here as narrative framing rather than confirmed biographical fact. He wrote the happiest songs in pop history, while hiding the saddest parts of himself. This is the untold story of Benny Andersson, the quiet genius behind ABBA. Long before ABBA became one of the best-selling acts in music history, Benny Andersson was simply a child captivated by sound. He grew up immersed in classical music and Swedish folk traditions, learning the language of melody and structure years before he ever touched a synthesizer. The accordion and church harmonies of his youth gave him a musical foundation that had little to do with trends or disco lights. It was rooted in something older and steadier. That foundation shaped everything that came after. Where much of ABBA's sound would later be associated with glossy, danceable pop, the underlying architecture often came from somewhere quieter and more traditional. Andersson's creative partnership with Björn Ulvaeus became one of the most productive songwriting collaborations in pop history. The division of labor was clear. Andersson largely shaped the chords, the tension, the emotional undercurrent of a song, while Ulvaeus focused on lyrics and narrative. Together, they built songs that sounded deceptively simple on the surface, but carried real emotional weight underneath. In the studio, Andersson had a reputation for relentless perfectionism, not chasing technical flawlessness so much as chasing a specific feeling. He was known to work and rework a single harmony for hours, searching not for polish but for something closer to emotional honesty. Take Dancing Queen. On the surface, it's pure joy. But listen to the chords underneath. There's a loneliness there. That was Benny, putting light and shadow in the same song. While Agnetha Falskog and Annie Frid Lyngstad became the public faces of ABBA, Andersson worked largely out of view. He has spoken in interviews over the years about the odd experience of helping build a global phenomenon while rarely being recognized as part of its image. Fans and press coverage tended to focus on the singers, their voices, their fashion, their personal lives, while the men writing and producing the music stayed in the background. Beyond songwriting, Andersson also often found himself in the role of mediator within the group, smoothing over creative disagreements and helping hold the band together during periods of tension. That kind of behind-the-scenes labor rarely gets acknowledged, and over the years it can quietly take a toll. Much of what made ABBA's music distinctive, some critics and biographers argue, came from Andersson's tendency to embed melancholy inside upbeat melodies, giving even their most joyful songs a bittersweet undertone. He was also an early adopter of studio technology, experimenting with synthesizers and multi-track recording at a time when many contemporaries relied on simpler arrangements. That willingness to experiment helped lay groundwork that later pop production would build on. One recurring theme in retrospectives about Andersson is the idea that he used composition as an emotional outlet, a way to work through feelings that were harder to express directly in conversation. Whether or not that was a conscious choice, it's a pattern many songwriters describe, channeling difficult experiences into music rather than confronting them head-on. This lens has led some observers to reinterpret ABBA's saddest songs, tracks like The Winner Takes It All and One of Us, not simply as fictional narratives, but as indirect reflections of real tension within the band, particularly around Andersson's relationship with Lyngstad. Andersson and Lyngstad's relationship began in the recording studio, where creative collaboration blurred into something more personal. By many accounts, their bond was built less on conventional romance and more on a shared musical language, a way of communicating that didn't always translate outside the studio walls. Their personalities reportedly differed in ways that made the partnership complicated. Lyngstad has been described as emotionally open and expressive, while Andersson tended to be more reserved, more comfortable working through a piano than through direct conversation. That contrast may have strengthened their creative output, while straining the relationship itself. Some biographers and interviewers have suggested that Andersson found it easier to be emotionally present in the studio than in daily life, that songwriting became a kind of substitute for direct vulnerability. If true, That dynamic would help explain why some of ABBA's most personal-sounding songs emerged during a period of real strain between the two of them. Their relationship ultimately did not survive, mirroring a broader pattern within the band. Two marriages within the group eventually dissolved even as the music itself continued to thrive commercially. The public largely saw only the glamorous surface. The tension underneath was far less visible. For years, Andersson and Ulvaeus were sometimes cast publicly as the technical, less emotionally expressive half of ABBA, the brains behind the operation, in contrast to the more visible emotional presence of the singers. That characterization, according to later reflections, never quite matched how Andersson actually experienced the songwriting process, which he has described as deeply personal and emotionally driven. Being framed as a technician rather than an artist is a common frustration among producers and composers who work largely behind the scenes. Critics and fans often treated ABBA's catalog as catchy but shallow pop, when in fact a great deal of craft and emotional intention went into the arrangements. Over time, this kind of under-recognition can shape how an artist thinks about legacy, less about chasing fame, and more about wanting the work itself to be understood. ABBA's dissolution in the early 1980s wasn't marked by a dramatic falling out. By most accounts, it was a gradual erosion. Years of touring, creative demands, and personal strains slowly wearing down the group's collective energy. There wasn't a single blow-up or public scandal. The music simply stopped feeling as vital as it once had. Andersson has spoken about staying involved partly out of a sense of obligation rather than pure creative excitement toward the end. The group never formally sat down to discuss the split. It happened more as an unspoken drift than a deliberate decision. Lyngstad reportedly moved on emotionally before the official end came. For Andersson, processing the group's dissolution apparently took much longer. Looking back, he has framed the end less as scandal and more as creative exhaustion, a natural conclusion after years of pressure, rather than any singular rupture. After ABBA disbanded, Andersson moved away from the pop spotlight and into theater, orchestral work, and film scoring. Projects like Chess and Christina Fran de Vemela gave him room to explore more personal and introspective territory, separate from the commercial machinery of pop stardom. This period has often been described as a kind of creative rebuilding, a chance to reconnect with music on his own terms, without the pressures of fame or bandmates' expectations shaping the work. In later interviews, Andersson has reflected on this stretch of my career as formative, allowing him to process experiences from the ABBA years with more distance and perspective than he had at the time. In his later years, he has also taken on a mentoring role with younger Scandinavian composers, passing along not just technical knowledge, but insight into the emotional and interpersonal challenges that come with a creative career. It's framed by those close to him as an attempt to offer perspective he wishes he'd had earlier. The broader takeaway from retrospectives like this one is that ABBA's success wasn't built on effortless harmony, but on four individuals navigating real personal complexity while creating some of pop music's most enduring songs. The polished, joyful image the public saw on stage coexisted with private struggles that rarely made headlines. None of this diminishes what ABBA accomplished. If anything, it reframes it. The band's music has remained beloved for decades not despite the human complexity behind it, but arguably because that complexity gave the songs real emotional depth. Andersson's architecture of sound, meticulous, layered, quietly melancholic even at its most upbeat, reflected something genuine, even when the man behind it stayed largely out of the spotlight. Now in his late 70s, Andersson has had decades to reflect on that period of his life. Public retrospectives suggest a shift from guardedness toward more openness about the difficulties of that era, less concerned with preserving a flawless image of the band, and more interested in acknowledging its human, imperfect reality. What do you think? Did ABBA's pain make their music better? Let me know in the comments. A final note, much of the emotional and biographical detail here is drawn from secondhand retrospectives, interpretive journalism, and video essays rather than primary sourced, directly quoted interviews. If you want a more reliably sourced account of Andersson's life and ABBA's history, I'd recommend cross-referencing with established biographies or verified interview transcripts.